A 73-year-old veteran quietly boarded a commercial flight. No medals, no uniform, just a worn duffel bag and a peaceful presence. But when a flight attendant shoved him aside and accused him of being aggressive, everything stopped. What she didn't know, that man had led missions the government still won't talk about. He'd served this country longer than she'd been alive. And when he finally stood up, not with anger, but with quiet resolve, it wasn't just the passengers who listened. 20 minutes later, military Hummers were waiting on the runway. Who was he, really? Why did the military respond so fast? And why did the airline fall so hard, so publicly? But more importantly, how did a man with so much power stay so silent for so long? This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about dignity, about what happens when a system built on quiet disrespect finally meets someone who refuses to shrink. If you believe respect must be earned and protected, then this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, buckle in because the truth is about to take flight. The overhead lights in Gate 22G flickered once, then stabilized, casting a soft hum across the carpeted waiting area. Outside the wide terminal windows, the afternoon sun burned low over the distant runways, throwing long, golden beams across polished floors. A flight to Denver had just pulled away, leaving behind the low murmur of fresh conversations, the rhythmic roll of wheeled carry-ons, and the occasional feedback of the intercom announcing delays or pre-boardings. Seated in one of the molded plastic chairs bolted to the floor, Robert Ellison, 73 years old, exhaled slowly and folded his hands over a weathered copy of Letters to a Young Soldier. The spine was cracked, corners turned from decades of travel, service, and rereads. He wasn't reading not actively. His eyes drifted from family clusters huddled near charging stations to a toddler melting down in front of a vending machine. His gaze was calm, not distant, but observing a man who had long ago learned the art of stillness. He wore a dark olive jacket, old but clean and neatly creased slacks. His hat, a worn charcoal gray flat cap, rested in his lap. His shoes, polished but soft at the edges, hinted at the many miles they'd covered. His body bore the quiet stiffness of old injuries and long marches. But there was something about the way he sat upright, hands folded, back never fully resting, that suggested he was still fully present. Robert didn't fly often anymore. Not because he feared it after all. He'd jumped out of helicopters at 19, but because these days, airports felt less like gateways and more like endurance tests. Still, this trip was different. It was not for duty. It was for Miles, his newborn great-grandson, born just last week in Austin. Robert had seen pictures on his daughter's phone, soft cheeks, a little swirl of hair, and a peaceful look that seemed untouched by the world's noise. He smiled faintly, just thinking about it. 20 feet away, near the gate podium, Dana Whitaker, the flight attendant for Flight 715 to Austin, checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. She was in her mid-30s, sharp blonde ponytail pulled tight, uniform crisp, mouth set in that neutral line between forced politeness and growing irritation. Her eyes darted between the waiting passengers and the tablet screen in front of her. She was thinking about two things: the low score on last week's internal service audit, and the mounting pressure to maintain an on-time departure today. There had already been a minor mechanical delay earlier, and every minute shaved from boarding could help reset the schedule. The last thing she needed was stragglers, or difficult passengers. Dana straightened her name badge and pasted on a mechanical smile as a young couple in business attire approached to ask about early boarding. Her tone brightened, just slightly. Of course, welcome aboard. Back in row B. Robert shifted slightly in his seat. His hip ached in that familiar way it did when the air pressure changed. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small silver case, not a phone, but an old photo holder. Inside, tucked neatly behind a ribbon, was a black and white snapshot of him and Evelyn, his late wife. The picture was worn thin at the edges. She had been the calm to his storm, the logic to his instinct, the home after every tour. Don't be late. He had told her once before boarding a mission flight decades ago. She had just laughed. Don't worry, I'll still be right here. Even now. Robert carried her with him. Now, pre-boarding passengers for Flight 715 to Austin. The intercom crackled. Those needing assistance or extra time to board may now line up. Robert stood slowly, gripping the armrest as he pushed himself up with practiced care. He wasn't frail, but the world expected slowness from a man his age and he didn't bother correcting it. With one hand, he picked up a small, perfectly packed black duffel, no wheels, no oversized luggage, everything he needed fit in that bag. As he made his way to the gate, a younger woman bumped him slightly with her carry-on. She turned briefly to glance back, then dismissed him with a half-smile. Dana noticed the contact but offered no assistance, instead nodding politely to the next passenger in line who carried a designer handbag. When Robert finally stepped up to the podium, Dana looked at him as if scanning a barcode. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Boarding pass," she said curtly. Robert handed it over with a polite nod. She glanced at it. "Zone 2. Go ahead." She didn't move aside. He had to step carefully past her. He paused at the entryway to the jet bridge, giving one last look back toward the seating area, as if anchoring a memory. Then he disappeared down the corridor. Dana watched him go, her expression unreadable. Inside the aircraft, the lighting was muted. Robert made his way down the narrow aisle, feeling the eyes of already seated passengers glance up and then away. No one offered to help with his bag, not that he would have accepted. He placed it in the overhead bin slowly, carefully. A brief wince crossed his face as he adjusted the angle. Dana walked by behind him, catching the moment. "You need help?" "Sir?" she asked, tone flat. Robert turned gently. "No, thank you. Just make it quick." "Okay, we're tight on time." She moved past without waiting for a response. Robert settled into seat 22B by the window. He pulled out his book again. Though he didn't read, his mind wandered to Texas skies and the tiny baby waiting at the other end of this flight. The airplane's ambient noise wrapped around him like a dull blanket, the hum of the APU, the occasional metallic thunk of carry-ons being shoved into bins, and the murmured negotiations over armrests and window shades. Robert Ellison sat quietly in 22B, second seat from the window on the left-hand side. His aisle neighbor hadn't arrived yet, and that granted him a small gift of stillness. He let his shoulders relax and his eyes drift out the window. The tarmac glowed in the late afternoon sun, streaks of orange sliding across the metal wings. He hoped this flight would be quiet, uneventful. He had done his share of adrenaline in younger years behind sandbags, in dense jungle, under tracer fire. These days, he cherished silence, especially the kind that didn't have to be earned. But peace like dignity was often granted conditionally. He didn't hear her approaching. He just felt it, the subtle change in air pressure as someone hovered just behind his seat. "Excuse me," came the voice. Brisk, impatient. "Sir, I'll need you to move your bag." Robert turned, puzzled. "Pardon, the flight attendant, Dana Whitaker." Her name tag, glinting under the overhead light, gestured to the small duffel tucked tightly under his seat. "FAA policy," she said flatly. "Personal items go fully under the seat in front of you, not halfway sticking out." He glanced down. The bag was flush, barely protruding. He had placed it there countless times on other flights, but he said nothing. He leaned forward slowly, knees creaking, and nudged the bag 2 inches further in. "There you go," he said quietly. Dana stared a beat longer than necessary. Then she walked away. Across the aisle, a young man in his 20s, earbuds in, hoodie up, had his backpack sprawled out like a small animal across both footwells. Dana passed right by without saying a word. Robert noticed, but he let it go. He reached again for letters to a young soldier, thumbing through pages until he found one marked with a paperclip. The passage was short, but weighted. "The power of control lies not in strength, but in choosing when not to use it." He read it twice. The seat beside him, 22C, filled moments later with a woman who smelled faintly of lavender and wore reading glasses low on her nose. She smiled at him. He smiled back. They exchanged names. Her name was Martha Hale, a retired school counselor en route to visit her sister in San Marcos. Their conversation was short but warm, polite questions, mutual nods, the kind of simple civility that reminded Robert why he still believed in people, even when the world didn't always return the courtesy. Further up the aisle, Dana was helping a man in 8D rearrange 2 suitcases that didn't fit together. Her voice had changed. Softer, almost flirtatious. "You're all set," she told him with a wink. "Let me know if you need anything else during the flight." Robert glanced down at the row of scuffed floor tiles between his shoes. This, he thought, is the game. A smile for one passenger, a scold for another. The hierarchy of who is seen and who is simply tolerated. He'd lived long enough to recognize the pattern. It didn't take yelling or slurs. It was subtler now, sharper in its restraint. The man in the row behind him sneezed twice, loudly. Dana returned a moment later to check overhead bins. She paused near Robert again, watching him tuck his book away. "Tray, table up," she said. He nodded and did as asked. Then she lingered. "I saw you struggle with your bag earlier. You know you could have gate-checked it." Her tone was pleasant on the surface, but there was a hook underneath the unspoken suggestion that maybe he didn't belong, that maybe his pace was a problem. Robert looked up at her, not unkindly. "I prefer to keep it with me." She gave a small shrug, the kind that said, "Suit yourself," then turned on her heel. Martha, beside him, leaned in gently. "Don't let her get under your skin." Robert offered her a calm half-smile. "Oh, I've had tougher officers," he said. But the truth was it did get under his skin. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. Because even now, with a lifetime of service behind him, with a bad knee from a jungle patrol and a chest full of memories no one asked about, he still had to decide how much of himself to give away in public. He sat back, pressed his spine gently into the seat, and let the air settle again. 10 rows behind him. Dana leaned against the galley counter and scrolled her phone quickly before slipping it away. The delay clock was ticking in her mind. She was behind again. The crew was watching, and she had a supervisor waiting for a report. That's why she bristled, not because of Robert, but because he made her feel slow, like time she didn't have. And in her mind, even if she'd never admit it, there was an image of what a problem passenger looked like, and Robert, with his deliberate movements, his quiet stillness, his refusal to play small ticked just enough of those boxes to trigger her frustration. Door closing in 5. The captain's voice crackled from the intercom. "Final walk," someone said behind her. Dana stood, took a breath, and began pacing the aisle again. Robert didn't move, but inside something was beginning to shift. The plane was nearly full now. Passengers squeezed down the aisle in clusters, murmuring apologies, angling overhead bins shut with tired arms and annoyed sighs. Somewhere near row 10 a baby had begun to cry, not loud, just the kind of fretful, tired cry that pierced through layers of travel noise. Robert Ellison, seated in 22B, watched it all unfold with practiced calm. He felt the first hint of pressure in his lower back, not sharp, but insistent. The familiar tug that let him know he'd sat still too long. He needed to use the restroom before takeoff. Better to go now. While the plane was still grounded and the aisle passable, he glanced over at Martha, his seatmate, who had just pulled out a crossword. "Excuse me a moment," he said softly. "Of course," she replied, smiling and tucking her legs to the side. Robert rose slowly, steadying himself with a light hand on the armrest. He waited for a small break in the flow of boarding passengers, then stepped into the aisle with deliberate care. As he moved forward, he approached the galley space near the front of the economy cabin. Dana Whitaker, the flight attendant, was standing there, her back partially turned as she spoke to a man in business-class clean suit, voice full of complaint. "No, this crew isn't the same as your flight yesterday, sir," Dana said, her tone syrupy, "but I'll make sure you're taken care of." The man waved his hand dismissively, already tapping at his phone. Robert waited politely for her to finish. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently. Dana didn't turn. "Just a moment," she snapped, eyes still fixed on the other passenger. He waited. Another 30 seconds passed. The final boarding announcement came faintly over the intercom. People were beginning to buckle seat belts. Robert cleared his throat. "Sorry, ma'am. I just need to pass through." She whirled around. The customer service smile dropped like a curtain. Her eyes hardened. "Sir," she said sharply. "As I said, one moment." Robert held her gaze. Calm, unthreatening. It will only take a minute. To the man in business class, it was a scene barely worth glancing at. But for Dana, the moment snapped something inside, a flicker of embarrassment in front of a high-status passenger, a feeling of being questioned, challenged. She stepped toward Robert, closing the space between them too fast. "You don't tell me how to do my job," she hissed under her breath. Then, with no warning, she shoved him. Her palm landed squarely on his right shoulder. Not a nudge, not a gentle redirect. A shove. Robert, not expecting it, stumbled back a half step. His arm flew out to steady himself on a seat back. His bag swung slightly from his shoulder. Thunk. His book, Letters to a Young Soldier, slipped from his coat pocket and hit the aisle floor. Gasps came from nearby rows. Martha, watching from 22C, was already unbuckling her belt. A few rows behind, a college-aged woman with curly hair and gold-rimmed glasses instinctively reached for her phone. Robert straightened slowly. There was no drama in his motion, no raised voice, no threat, just a heavy silence, like the kind before thunder. His face showed more than pain. It showed betrayal. Not personal, historical, familiar. He bent slowly, picked up his book, brushed the cover off with a gentle hand. Dana stood frozen for a second, eyes darting to the passengers watching her. Then, in a tone too loud to sound authentic, she said, "He was crowding me. I felt unsafe." Her voice wavered slightly, a performance unraveling in real time. The man in the suit looked up now, confused. Others craned their necks. The woman with the phone, her camera already rolling, shifted slightly in her seat to steady the angle. Robert turned and walked back to his seat. Each step felt longer than it should, the weight of 100 eyes pressed on his back. His dignity, always quietly worn, now clung to him like armor. Martha gave him space to sit again. "Are you all right?" she whispered. He nodded once. "Fine," he murmured, but he wasn't. Not physically, his shoulder throbbed now, but more than that, something inside him had folded inward. He had endured worse bullets, storms, funerals, but this moment carried a poison made from something older than anger. He looked out the window and didn't really see anything. Inside his jacket, just behind the inner pocket, rested a device no one had noticed. It wasn't a smartphone. It was a small, military-grade communicator, rugged, outdated, and utterly secure. He opened it. The green screen blinked to life. The buttons clicked softly beneath his fingers. He pressed 7 digits a sequence burned into memory, never written down. He brought the device close to his lips. "Ellison. Flight 715, Gate 22G, he whispered. "Request Protocol Indigo, civilian escalation, physical contact, unprovoked, a pause, a breath, estimated response time." He listened. Another nod, another click. The screen dimmed. He slipped the device back into his coat. Outside. The sun had shifted, throwing long shadows over the tarmac. Inside, Dana Whitaker had returned to the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she poured water into paper cups. The incident wasn't over. It had only just begun. For a long moment, Robert Ellison simply sat there. His hands rested on his knees, his body tilted slightly toward the window, as if watching the mechanics on the tarmac, though in truth. His gaze didn't focus on anything beyond the glass. Seat 22B was not a battlefield, and yet his breathing had taken on the rhythm he'd learned in war: slow, deep, deliberate, controlled, control. That word again. He had spent a lifetime cultivating it in barracks, in foxholes, in boardrooms full of officers younger than him. And now, here he was, 73, quietly breathing through a pain he had not earned, not from age or accident, but from another person's unchecked disdain. Beside him, Martha Hale watched him with quiet concern. She didn't touch his arm. She didn't interrupt his thoughts. She simply sat with him. The silence between them felt like respect. 10 rows behind, Kayla Moore, the young law student with the sharp eyes and steady hands, stared at her screen. The video file had saved automatically high resolution, clear sound. Dana's voice was unmistakable. So was the shove. And, more importantly, the look on Mr. Ellison's face afterward, not anger, not shame, but something deeper, something that made her want to cry. She turned to the passenger beside her, a man in his 50s reading a tech magazine. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Did you see what happened?" He looked up, surprised. "The guy who got pushed?" "Yeah, I caught the tail end of it. What's going on? I recorded it. Everything." His eyebrows lifted. You got it on video, Kayla nodded. Good, the man said softly, almost reverently. Good. Meanwhile, up front, near the galley, Dana Whitaker moved with sharp, flustered energy. She arranged napkins with too much force, closed the water drawer 3 times. She glanced up the aisle, saw Robert sitting still, not looking at her, not even looking at anyone, and felt a prickling sensation at the base of her neck. Something about his stillness unnerved her. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't complaining, he wasn't even talking to anyone. That's worse, she thought. That's unpredictable. She tried to reassure herself. The captain would have her back. These things happened. He bumped her. He got too close. She just acted instinctively. She repeated that phrase in her mind like a mantra, instinctively. I reacted. I felt cornered. Except she knew she hadn't. She knew it was something else entirely. She knew he had embarrassed her. In front of that entitled business passenger, in front of others. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't cursed. He had simply existed in her space without shrinking, and she had pushed him for it. The realization was beginning to crawl under her skin. Back in 22B. Robert shifted slightly and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers closed around the small device once again. Not a phone, not something you'd find at an electronics store, but a secure field communicator. The kind used only by certain ranks, in certain networks. Legacy tech, still encrypted. He opened it quietly and checked the status line. Connected Network 12, Priority Access. He tapped out a message on the small keypad. Then, lifting the device close to his lips, he pressed the side button. Ellison, Tier 3, Gate 22G, Civilian Conflict, confirmed, 1 incident, physical, Flight 715 to Austin, standing by. There was no delay. A voice came through the earpiece firm, clipped, mail, Tier Protocol authorized, confirm package identity. Robert spoke without pause. Ellison, Robert Aaron, Master Sergeant, retired. Verification code 76 Bravo Foxtrot. Confirmed. Mobile response ETA 20 minutes. Maintain location. Robert clicked the device shut. It made no sound, not even a beep. Martha, beside him, glanced over. Everything all right? She asked gently. Robert nodded. Yes, ma'am. I've just made a call. She tilted her head. Family. He smiled faintly. Something like that. She didn't press. There was something in his voice, soft, but grounded, that told her this wasn't the kind of call you asked questions about. A few minutes passed. A light turbulence jostled the aircraft gently. The engines had not yet started. Pre-flight checks dragged on longer than expected. The air felt stiller than it should have. The captain hadn't made an announcement in several minutes. Passengers shifted in their seats. A low hum of uncertainty spread, and then a voice finally crackled overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're currently awaiting a brief confirmation from Gate Control. Thank you for your patience. Dana blinked. That wasn't part of the script. She stepped toward the cockpit and knocked twice. Captain Evans, tall and silver-haired, opened the door halfway. What's going on? Dana asked in a half-whisper. Evans' face was unreadable. We've been told to hold paperwork delay. That's all. But we're already behind schedule. She pressed. I'm aware. He shut the door gently. Dana turned and scanned the cabin again, and now she saw it a change. Subtle, but real. More people were watching her, not just watching, studying her. She caught Kayla's eye 3 rows back. The girl didn't look away. Dana's throat tightened. Robert Ellison remained still. He hadn't spoken since returning to his seat. He hadn't accused her, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't called for the captain. He had made a quiet phone call, and somewhere outside that airplane, wheels were turning, the seconds stretched, then the minutes. Some passengers took the silence as a cue to return to idle distractions, flipping pages, opening snack bags, toggling through seat-back screens that hadn't fully activated yet. But others had begun to notice. It wasn't just the delay. It was the way the crew moved, too stiff, too quiet, too much glancing over shoulders. Robert Ellison remained still, his eyes soft but awake, his posture composed. The call was done. Nothing to add. He had made his report a simple, factual message. No anger in his voice, just the truth. Now, as always, his duty was patience. Beside him, Martha Hale shifted nervously. They said just a paperwork delay. But, she murmured, "Why do I feel like that's not the whole story?" Robert gave her a small smile. "You've got good instincts." Meanwhile, 2 rows behind them, Kayla Moore was hunched forward, elbows on her tray table, staring at the paused frame on her phone screen the exact second Dana Whitaker's hand collided with Robert's shoulder. Her pulse still hadn't slowed. She'd seen things go viral. She'd studied civil rights law, read endless articles on microaggressions, excessive force, power imbalance. But this wasn't theory anymore. It was here. It had a face. It had weight. And she had it all on camera. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it yet. Post it, save it, send it somewhere, or show it to someone on board. In row 20, a man in a U. This Navy windbreaker, older, Caucasian, maybe late 50s, leaned slightly across the aisle. "Miss," he whispered to Kayla, "I saw what happened. You filming it." Kayla turned, hesitant. "Yes." The man nodded once. "Don't delete that. Whatever happens next, don't lose it." Kayla tucked her phone tightly into her hoodie pocket. Her hands were shaking, up near the front. Dana stood frozen near the bulkhead, trying to appear composed as she refilled the water jug, but her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the handle. The captain hadn't said a word since the vague announcement about paperwork, but she knew something wasn't right. She could feel it crawling under her skin. She pulled out her tablet and opened the cabin report form, typed a quick entry, 22B, male passenger, aggressive approach in galley. I was forced to create distance. Flight is now delayed. She paused, stared at the screen. It was true, sort of, not exactly. But wasn't it her thumb hovered over the submit button? She heard the cabin door click. Dana glanced up. No one entered. Yet. But something changed in the body language of the flight attendants, in the murmurs leaking from the cockpit. The door had opened to let someone speak to the captain, not standard procedure during boarding. She backed away slowly and approached Captain Evans, who had just emerged from the cockpit with a stiff expression. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" Dana asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over her shoulder directly toward the rear of the cabin. His eyes met Robert's for a second. Then he looked away. "I'm waiting on new instructions," Evans said. "Please continue normal service protocol, but we haven't even closed the main door. It's not on us. Right?" She pushed. Evans offered nothing more than a tight nod and disappeared back into the cockpit. Dana returned to the galley. What is happening, she thought. Why has this delay taken so long? A moment later, her fellow flight attendant, Nico, whispered behind her. "Did you touch him?" he asked. Quiet, direct. Dana's jaw tightened. "He came at me. I had to redirect. I was in the aisle. He was just standing. You kind of shoved him." Dana's nostrils flared. "Are you seriously throwing me under the bus right now?" Nico looked away, and just like that, Dana felt the shift, the quiet unraveling of the story she had been crafting in her head. A few rows back, Martha leaned over to Robert again. "I don't mean to pry," she said, voice low, "but are you someone?" Robert turned his head gently toward her. "I'm just a man," he said, "a man who's lived long enough to know when silence is dangerous." Martha absorbed that. She didn't ask again. The ambient sound of the aircraft, the fans, the lights, the footfalls felt louder now, more distinct, like the hush before something big, and then a faint vibration. It began low, almost indistinguishable, like a heavy cart rolling down the jet bridge. But it didn't stop. It grew louder. Outside the windows on the left side of the plane, shadows began to move, shapes low to the ground, matte green, purposeful. Some passengers leaned toward their windows. "What's that?" a child asked. "Trucks," someone said. "No, those are military." Kayla craned her neck. So did the man in the navy jacket. Robert didn't move. Martha covered her mouth slowly. Dana, who had just stepped into the aisle again, heard the rising murmur and turned toward the window. Her tray of waters slipped an inch. Then her eyes went wide. 3 dark green military Hummers, lights rotating silently, were pulling up directly to the base of the jet bridge. She stopped walking. The blood drained from her face. "What the hell?" she whispered. She stumbled backward into the galley, bumping the counter. "What is this?" she hissed at Nico. He didn't answer. Across the cabin, Robert closed his eyes briefly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't vindicated. He was simply ready. The first thing passengers noticed was not the soldiers. It was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The steady hum of airflow through the vents, the faint whine of electronics, the ever-present low rumble of the auxiliary power unit, all of it seemed to fade at once, like someone had pulled the plug on a living thing. The engines shut down. The cabin dimmed slightly, lights remained, but the tone changed, subtle but deeply felt. The aircraft was no longer preparing for departure. It was waiting. "Why'd it get quiet?" someone whispered across row 18. "We're not pushing back another," said. In 22B, Robert Ellison sat as still as he had the moment he placed the call. But now, his stillness no longer blended in, it stood out. It felt deliberate, commanding. Martha Hale folded her hands in her lap. She glanced toward the windows again, where the last of the daylight flickered over the matte green armor of 3 military Humvees parked directly beside the jet bridge. "Mr. Ellison," she began, but stopped. He looked at her gently. "Yes, ma'am, who?" "Are you?" Robert turned his gaze to the back of the seat in front of him. He didn't answer right away. "I was a soldier," he said at last, "long time ago." She nodded, but the answer didn't satisfy her curiosity, nor the weight settling in her chest. Up front, Dana Whitaker couldn't keep still. She hovered near the jump seat, then paced toward the galley again, tapping her fingers against the metal edge of the counter. Her throat was dry, her vision sharp. Every sound was now amplified: the rustle of jackets, the zip of bags being closed, the shuffle of feet as someone crossed their legs. She leaned toward Nico, whispering urgently, "Why are there military vehicles outside?" He didn't respond. "Nico, say something." "I think you already know," he said, his voice barely audible. Dana's lips parted, then closed. Her heart thudded in her chest, a dull, unrelenting drumbeat. Across the cabin, a man near the exit rows slowly stood. He turned to the woman seated next to him. "I've flown every week for 13 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen them shut the engines down like this unless someone's being detained." The word slipped through the air like smoke. Detained. Rows of faces turned toward one another, not loud, not panicked, just eyes, looking, searching, judging, and slowly, collectively, turning toward Robert. He didn't flinch under the weight of the attention. His fingers gently rested on his lap. His breathing remained calm, but there was something new in his posture now, not defensive, not even proud, prepared. Across the aisle, Kayla Moore leaned toward the man in the navy jacket. "Do you think they're here for him?" The man nodded slowly. "I don't think they're here to arrest him." Kayla's breath caught. "You think they're here because of him?" The man didn't reply, but his face said enough. Back at the front, Captain Evans reemerged from the cockpit and took a few steps down the aisle. His eyes scanned the rows. His expression was a tight professional, but clearly unsettled. He stopped near row 16, placed a hand gently on the headrest of an empty seat, and looked directly at Robert. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A nod, a flicker of recognition. Then the captain turned and walked back without saying a word. Dana saw it. She stepped into his path just before he reached the cockpit door. "What's happening?" Captain Evans paused. He studied her face, the tension in her jaw, the sweat beginning to form along her hairline. "You'll want to stay professional," he said, his voice neutral. "That doesn't answer my question." Evans didn't blink. It wasn't a question. And then the front cabin door opened again. This time, not for a mechanic, not for a gate agent. Two military officers in uniform stepped through the door with precise, controlled movements, no weapons drawn, no loud commands, just presence. They wore clean fatigues, their boots polished, their expressions calm but hyper-aware. One scanned the forward cabin in a slow sweep. The other made eye contact with the captain. Behind them, a third figure stepped through, older, taller, bearing the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel. His nameplate read Grant. He carried no clipboard, no device, just authority. The entire plane fell into a thick, unnatural hush. Even the baby in row 10 had gone quiet. Launt. Colonel Grant walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes moving like sonar calm, intentional, precise. When he reached row 22, he stopped, and then, in a voice clear enough to carry through the entire plane, but spoken without force or showmanship, he said, "Master Sergeant Robert Ellison, are you all right, sir?" The words dropped like a boulder into still water. Mouths opened, eyes widened. A collective breath was drawn and never quite exhaled. Master Sergeant Sir Robert slowly looked up. "Yes, Colonel," he said quietly. "I am. Thank you for coming." The lieutenant colonel nodded, and in that brief moment, in that simple, mutual gaze, every assumption in that cabin shattered like glass under weight. For a long second, no one moved, no one blinked. The sound of the air conditioning returning to the cabin was the only movement in the space, a low hiss against the impossible silence that followed Lieutenant Colonel Grant's words. "Master Sergeant Robert Ellison, are you all right? Sir." The honorific didn't just carry weight, it carried history, it carried recognition, and it pulled the floor out from under everything Dana Whitaker thought she understood about who was who on this plane. Her eyes darted from the colonel's posture to Robert's quiet nod. She barely processed the moment, but her instinct screamed one thing. This wasn't about disciplining him. This was about protecting him. Passengers turned in their seats like sunflowers following the light. The tension in the rows melted into something new: awe, respect, confusion. Even Kayla Moore, who had captured the shove on camera, felt her breath catch again. She had known the situation was serious. She had not known it was this deep. The lieutenant colonel stepped closer to Robert's row. His voice softened slightly. "Do you require medical assistance?" "No, thank you," Robert replied. "I'm still functional." The line, dry and quiet, drew a few barely there chuckles from older passengers, those who recognized it as standard veteran humor, the kind of phrase used between men who had once patched each other up in silence. Robert shifted slightly in his seat, then met the colonel's eyes fully. "Has Tier Indigo been formally activated?" "It has," Grant confirmed. "You've triggered chain protocol. Command authority will be established once we've reviewed your report, but I'm here as your proxy until then." Martha Hale's lips parted. "Proxy." Robert leaned slightly toward her. "It means he speaks for my security and interests, in full." The man across the aisle, navy jacket, gave a low whistle. "Damn. He's Tier 3 verified." Kayla turned toward him. "What does that mean?" The man's voice dropped. "It means he's not just retired. He held command clearance, probably black-level ops. When someone like that activates an escalation code, the government listens, and fast, at the front of the plane." Captain Evans had stepped out of the cockpit. His face was pale, but he stood straight. He approached quietly, stopping just behind Grant. "Colonel," the captain said carefully, "this is unexpected." Grant gave a crisp nod. "It usually is." Captain Evans lowered his voice. "Should I initiate cabin lockdown?" "Not yet," Grant replied, "but I'll require statements. Starting now." Dana, standing to the side near the forward galley, stepped forward too quickly. "I already filed a report," she said, voice high. "He got in my space. I was just reacting." Grant turned to her. His face was polite, impassive, but it shut her up mid-sentence. "I'll ask for your formal statement in a moment. Ms. Whitaker, Dana Whitaker." He nodded once, then turned back to Robert. "I understand you wish to remain on this aircraft." "I do," Robert said. "As long as it remains a safe environment. I don't want special treatment. I just want to get where I'm going." Grant turned to Captain Evans. "Then I'll continue processing from within the cabin." "Understood," Evans replied. Just then, a fourth figure entered the aircraft, a woman in a blue corporate uniform. Her badge read Jordan Pierce, Regional Director, Passenger Services. She was mid-30s, efficient, and already absorbing the chaos without flinching. She approached Grant. "I was advised to assist with resolution," she said crisply. "You're corporate?" he asked. She nodded. "We've been alerted to the passenger's protected status. I'm here to ensure compliance, accountability, and, if necessary, containment. That last word made Dana visibly recoil. Containment, she said. And what does that mean? Pierce didn't answer her. Instead, she looked at Robert. Her voice shifted instantly soft. Professional, reverent. Mr. Ellison, on behalf of the airline, let me extend our sincere apology. Your experience aboard this aircraft is being taken extremely seriously. Robert gave a faint nod. Then I trust you'll allow the facts to speak. She looked at Kayla, who was now holding her phone in both hands like it was evidence in a courtroom. May I? Pierce asked. Kayla hesitated. Robert looked to her. Just a nod. Not commanding, just permission. Kayla stood, moved up the aisle, and handed the phone to Grant and Pierce. They leaned in, watching the clip play from the start. There was Robert, asking politely. Then Dana's sharp voice, the shove, the book falling, her loud insistence of he was crowding me. The video ended. Pierce's face hardened. Grant didn't blink. Copy that to my secure unit, Grant said. Kayla passed over her info with shaking fingers. Robert leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for just a moment. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't triumphant. He was tired, but he was seen. The phone screen dimmed as the last frame of the video faded. The silence that followed was heavy, not shocked like before, but loaded with something colder, weightier, like judgment handed down before a word was spoken. Ms. Jordan Pierce, the corporate director, stepped back from the phone with a clenched jaw. She didn't look at Dana Whitaker. Not yet. Instead, she turned to Lieutenant Colonel Grant, who stood beside her like a carved statue, arms behind his back. I've seen enough, Pierce said. That footage is sufficient to trigger immediate review protocol and grounds for personnel suspension. Dana's breath caught. Suspension. That video's taken out of context, Grant didn't raise his voice, then provide context. Ms. Whitaker? Dana looked around wildly. He was right in front of me. I didn't know his intentions. He wouldn't move when I asked. I felt cornered. Pierce remained still. The audio shows he asked calmly. Twice. No threats. No escalation. Just a request to pass. And your physical response, Grant added, was unnecessary, disproportionate, and clearly not reflexive. It was deliberate. Dana's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Robert still hadn't spoken. He sat in 22B, hands folded loosely over his lap, looking not at his accuser, but at the overhead panel. The air nozzle above him blew cool and steady. It reminded him of something, maybe a patrol helicopter overhead, maybe just the sound of wind at high altitude. Martha Hale whispered beside him, "You don't have to stay quiet." Robert turned slightly, his voice a breath. Sometimes silence tells a story better. But Kayla Moore had stood up now. Her voice, though young, carried strange steadiness. "My name is Kayla Moore," she began, "and I'm a third-year law student. I witnessed the incident firsthand. Mr. Ellison did not behave aggressively. He waited patiently and politely asked to use the restroom. She took a breath, then continued. Ms. Whitaker was the only one who raised her voice. When he calmly asked again, she shoved him with force. It wasn't an accident. It was targeted. Dana spun toward her. You don't know what I was feeling. I felt threatened. That's real. Pierce finally looked at her. And yet 5 passengers have already approached my office since you boarded, citing your tone, your behavior, and your pattern of selective professionalism. You know what that looks like from the outside. Dana's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean it like that, Let." Colonel Grant stepped forward now, facing the cabin. If anyone else witnessed the exchange and is willing to provide an account, now is the time. A man near row 20 raised his hand. Navy windbreaker. Calm gaze. "I did." He said, "I saw the whole thing." He stood. Name's Thomas Laird, former Navy. I've been in situations where real threats look like something. That man wasn't one. He was patient, respectful. She wasn't. He looked directly at Dana. "Maybe you were stressed. Maybe it's been building. But what I saw was someone deciding that an older man, and let's not ignore, a black man didn't deserve her respect." Gasps stirred quietly. Even Grant blinked at the bluntness. Thomas sat down. Dana's lips quivered. "I didn't. I'm not. That's not who I am." Pierce stepped forward, voice level. "Intent matters, but impact matters more." Robert finally stirred. He didn't rise, but he spoke, and the cabin seemed to still itself around his voice. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Ms. Whitaker," he said. Dana froze. "Because I've heard explanations all my life." Robert continued. "I've been told it was a misunderstanding when I was refused service. Told someone was just tired when they followed me around a store. Told someone was having a bad day when I was the one bleeding." He looked at her now, fully, not angrily, not accusing, but like someone who had seen her before, not just her, but what she was acting out. "You don't need me to forgive you," he said. "You need to see what you did." Dana's mouth opened, then closed, and just like that. She sat down on the jump seat beside the galley. Her shoulders curled inward. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just folded into herself like a person slowly realizing she'd stepped off a cliff without knowing the ground had disappeared beneath her. Colonel Grant turned to Pierce. "Are you prepared to proceed?" "I am," she said. "Pending documentation. She's to be removed from duty immediately. Termination pending further investigation." A murmur ran through the rows. Robert closed his eyes. Not from satisfaction, from sorrow. The first message went out just 12 minutes after the official review concluded. It was short, clinical, and clearly drafted in a panic. Statement from Skybridge Airlines. "We are aware of an incident involving one of our crew members and a passenger on Flight 715. The crew member has been immediately removed from duty pending investigation. We deeply regret any distress caused and are cooperating with federal personnel on site. Passenger safety and respect are our top priorities." By the time the statement hit the airline's social channels, passengers were already texting it to one another, and a few were quietly uploading their own photos of the military presence just outside the window. From the tarmac. The image was surreal. 3 green Humvees parked beside a civilian jet, backdrop by terminal glass and confused airport workers inside the plane. Dana Whitaker sat frozen in the forward jump seat, staring at her lap like it might contain a map out of this disaster. But there wasn't one. Her name was already being tagged on social media, paired with shaky cell phone footage and captions that weren't kind. She shoved a veteran. One post read, "Disrespect in uniform, no job." Another said, "Up and down the aisle." Passengers checked their phones. The atmosphere shifted from fear and silence to chatter, disbelief, outrage, and then support. Martha Hale, sitting beside Robert in 22B, gently touched his arm. "Do you want to say something?" she whispered. To them, Robert turned, puzzled. To the passengers, she clarified, They're looking at you. With respect, like you mean something again." He exhaled through his nose, not irritation, more like the weary breath of someone who had waited a long time for a moment like this to arrive and wasn't sure how to hold it. "I didn't do this for that," he said softly. "I know," she replied, "but they need to hear you." And so, with effort, Robert Ellison stood. It wasn't a grand motion, no flourish, but in that narrow aisle, among plastic seatbacks and scattered snack wrappers, it felt ceremonial. The rows fell silent. He turned toward the front of the cabin. "I'm not here to make a speech," he began. His voice was low, warm, but unwavering. "I didn't ask for military intervention. I didn't want drama, but when something crosses a line, silence becomes agreement, and I couldn't agree with this." People nodded. Someone whispered, "Amen. I served this country for over 30 years." Robert continued, "And for most of that time, I was invisible in rooms I helped build. I flew in coach while people I'd trained flew private. I got called sir on bases and boy in restaurants. So when someone pushes me because they think I don't belong," his voice caught, just briefly, "it's not about a seat. It's about all the seats I wasn't allowed to take, even when I earned them." A stillness spread. Even Captain Evans, standing quietly outside the cockpit, lowered his eyes. Robert looked toward Dana. "I don't want you fired," he said. Her head snapped up. "I want you to learn," he added. Dana blinked rapidly. "But if the only way the system listens," Robert said, turning back to the crowd, "is with humiliation and hashtags, then maybe that's the system that needs changing." Silence, then soft, scattered claps, not loud, not forced, just genuine. One by one, rows of people began applauding, not just in support, but in recognition. A salute, not military, but human. Robert nodded once, then sat. Outside the aircraft, the Skybridge executive team was already in high alert. In a sleek glass conference room near Gate 22G, Jordan Pierce was on a direct call with the airline's crisis PR director. "No, we can't suppress the story," she said flatly. "We already have multiple independent videos. One of them's gone viral in the last 7 minutes." She paused, listening. "No, apologizing won't hurt our legal liability. Not apologizing will." Another pause. "No, you don't need to coach him. He's not pressing charges. He hasn't asked for a dime. He asked for accountability and truth. That's it." Then she hung up. Behind her, Colonel Grant entered quietly. "I just spoke to Central," he said. "His record has been fully verified. We'll be sending a formal commendation request." Pierce nodded. "That'll help." Then she paused. "But it won't undo what happened." Grant didn't disagree. Back on the plane, the captain made the final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang through the cabin, "we've received clearance to resume departure procedures. We appreciate your patience during this unexpected delay." But it wasn't just patience passengers had shown, it was solidarity. As Robert buckled his seatbelt again, Martha leaned in. "You changed something today," she whispered. Robert smiled faintly. "Not the first time," he said, "just the loudest." The plane was finally airborne. The wheels lifted, the engines roared, and the nose of Flight 715 angled upward into the Texas sky like nothing had happened at all. But something had, and everyone on board felt it. The cabin was quiet, not a fearful quiet, like earlier, but the kind that comes after witnessing something irreversible, as if everyone had been invited into a private truth that could no longer be unseen. Robert Ellison stared out the window, watching the city fall away beneath a haze of twilight. He'd flown hundreds of times commercial, military, classified, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about destination, it was about distance, from the incident, from the system, from 1,000 smaller cuts he'd endured over the years but never addressed out loud. "Still with me?" Martha Hale asked softly. He turned. "I am." "You look far away." "I suppose I am." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "You held back a lot." Robert smiled faintly. "You only say that because you don't know how much more I could have said." She laughed quietly. "Fair." A few rows ahead, Kayla Moore stared down at her phone. Her thumbs hovered above her notes app. She'd started typing a thread, something to post, something that might go viral, but every word felt insufficient. How do you describe the moment a man becomes more than what people assumed? How do you condense a lifetime of quiet dignity into 280 characters? She erased what she had written. Instead, she typed a single sentence. "Today, I saw what respect looks like when the world finally sees the person it tried to ignore." She saved it as a draft. Meanwhile, near the front, Captain Evans had returned to his seat. He didn't speak much to the crew. Not because he was angry, but because he was thinking. He'd flown over 20 years, carried soldiers in and out of war zones, seen engines fail midair. But this was the first time he'd realized how often uniformed heroes walked right past him without him even noticing. Nico, the quieter attendant, passed through the cabin now. He didn't smile or offer drinks, just moved gently, checking on people, placing water bottles on tray tables without saying a word. When he reached Robert's row, he paused, then he knelt slightly. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Robert looked at him kindly. "You didn't push me." "No," Nico replied, "but I let it happen, and I didn't speak up." Robert nodded. "You are now." Nico swallowed, stood up, and moved on. In the forward galley, Dana Whitaker sat, still technically on the manifest, but under observation. Her replacement had taken over the service cart. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the slow collapse of the narrative she'd believed about herself. She wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. But something inside her had made it easy to push a man who looked like Robert. Something unexamined. Something she now couldn't ignore. When Ms. Jordan Pierce approached her, clipboard in hand, Dana didn't look up. Pierce didn't speak immediately. She sat across from her. "You'll be placed on unpaid leave pending formal hearing," she said gently. "There will be a process." Dana nodded. Pierce paused, then added, "Do you understand why this can't be ignored?" Dana's eyes finally lifted. "Yes," she whispered, "because if someone had done that to my father, I'd want the whole world to stop." Pierce studied her for a long moment, then stood and walked away, back in 22B. Robert leaned back. His eyes weren't tired, but they were distant, locked on the thin stream of sunlight streaking through the oval window. "You all right?" Martha asked. He didn't answer immediately. "When I joined the Army," he said quietly, "I was 19. People didn't call me sir. They called me things I wouldn't repeat in church. I slept on floors in towns that didn't want me. I took orders from men who couldn't pronounce my name." Martha didn't interrupt. "But when I put on that uniform," he continued, "I believed in something bigger. Not the flag, not the anthem, the idea that we could be more than where we started. He turned to her. Today, I was reminded that belief still matters. Martha reached over. She didn't say a word, just rested her hand gently on top of his. He allowed it. At the rear of the plane, a teenage boy who had watched the entire incident from 3 rows back turned to his mother. "Mom," he whispered, "was that man famous?" His mother shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "he was something better." The seatbelt sign pinged. The wheels touched the ground with a muted thump. And just like that, Flight 715 was no longer in the air, but everything had changed. As the aircraft rolled along the tarmac at Baltimore-Washington International, the familiar post-landing murmur began, bags shifting, trays closing, necks craning to see which gate they'd arrive at. But this time, there was more. Flashing lights lined the windows, not police but media vans. A camera crew stood on the jet bridge, lenses aimed straight at the front cabin door, and just beyond them, 2 officers from the Department of Defense stood waiting, not with weapons, but with medals. Inside the cabin, the passengers began to stir. "Whoa," the kid in row 10 said. Martha turned to Robert. "You ready for all this?" He gave a slight smile. "I'm used to parades when they're over. This one just came late." In the front galley, Dana Whitaker sat rigid, her face pale. Her name was trending online not because of an award, but because of a video. That video, the one Kayla had recorded, the one already passed through newsrooms. She wouldn't be walking out through the main doors. A Skybridge supervisor stood beside her with an escort badge and whispered instructions. Dana didn't respond. Across the cabin, Kayla Moore shut her phone off. The notifications were endless. The post she finally uploaded racking up thousands of shares in just hours. He didn't ask for justice. He asked to be seen. And finally we looked. She didn't care about the virality. She cared that the world was listening to him. A chime sounded. Captain Evans stood near the front and spoke clearly through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We'll begin deplaning shortly. Before that, I'd like to ask everyone on board to join me in recognizing a man who has quietly served this country, not just in uniform, but today, in courage." He looked toward row 22, Master Sergeant Robert Ellison. "We thank you." Applause erupted, but it wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, it was real. People clapped from their seats, some stood, the man in the navy jacket saluted. Even Nico, the quiet attendant, offered a small bow of his head. Robert stood, not proudly, just firmly, as if he were rising into himself. He walked toward the front of the plane, Martha beside him, Kayla just a step behind. No one blocked their way. No one tried to go ahead. It was his aisle now. When he reached the front, the doors opened, flashes fired, but Robert didn't flinch. A tall officer stepped forward, flanked by a government aide. "Sir, I'm Colonel Hastings. I've been asked to deliver this." He handed Robert a small case. Inside, a presidential citation for civil integrity, awarded for restraint, dignity under pressure, and service beyond the battlefield. Robert blinked, surprised. "I didn't. You didn't have to," Hastings said. "The people did." Reporters shouted questions from the gate. "Do you forgive the airline? What should happen to the attendant? Why didn't you press charges?" Robert lifted a hand. "Not in dismissal, in stillness. I'm not here to destroy anyone. he said. "I'm here to remind us what we protect when we wear this country's uniform and what we dishonor when we forget who wore it." Silence. Then camera shutters clicked. Then the world kept listening. Later, as the airport terminal returned to its rhythm, Jordan Pierce sat alone in a corner office reviewing the final report. She highlighted one line in the executive summary. "Systemic dignity failures often go unrecorded, until one moment forces us to listen." She looked up, out the window. She could still see Robert being greeted by 3 young recruits' boys, really, who looked at him like a living story. And he was. Not because he'd gone viral, because he'd endured quietly, and finally been heard. That baggage claim. Robert finally turned to Martha. "You didn't have to stay this long," he said. "I know," she replied, smiling, "but I wanted to see what grace looks like after the applause fades." He chuckled. "Turns out, it looks like a carousel full of unclaimed luggage." She laughed. They stood there, 2 strangers bound by 42 rows in a moment that had changed everyone on board. And as the belt churned on, Robert picked up his worn canvas duffel, the same one he'd carried for decades. Patches on the sides, faded stitching, reliable, just like him. 3 days later, Robert Ellison sat alone on his back porch, a worn flannel blanket over his knees, the soft buzz of cicadas filling the evening air like distant applause. The media storm had come and gone. His name had trended on every platform. People had called him a hero, a saint, a symbol. But he wasn't any of those. He was just tired, and not because of age, because being seen was heavy, especially after a lifetime of being passed over. On the small table beside him sat the unopened envelope from the Department of Defense. It contained formal commendation papers, an invitation to speak at a leadership summit, and a handwritten note from a senior Pentagon official. He hadn't read it. Not yet. Instead, he stared out at the wind moving through the trees, slow, unbothered, like time had finally decided to give him a moment to breathe. The back gate creaked. Martha Hale stepped through, holding 2 coffees in a small brown bag. "You look like a man who needed a cinnamon scone," she said. Robert smiled. "And I look like that often?" She sat beside him, handing him the coffee. "They're still talking about you, you know." "I figured," he said, sipping. "The mailbox has opinions." Martha chuckled. The airline issued a follow-up apology, full policy review, diversity training overhaul, front-page press release. Robert raised an eyebrow. All that for 1 seat. She shook her head. All that because they finally got caught. They sat in silence for a while, not awkward, just comfortable, like 2 souls who had been through a storm and found the quiet on the other side. After a moment, Martha spoke. "Can I ask you something? Anything. What made you stand up that day? Not physically. I mean after everything you've seen, everything you've been through. What made that moment the one where you said, 'Enough'?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the fading light. Then he said, "Because she looked at me like I was small, and for the first time, I realized I didn't agree." Martha blinked. Robert continued. "I spent so long trying not to be seen because it was safer that way, but I realized safety isn't dignity, and silence isn't peace." He turned to her. "And if I don't speak when someone pushes me down, then I'm just helping them do it." A long pause. Then Martha nodded, swallowing the weight of his words. "Then I'm glad you stood." Elsewhere, Kayla Moore sat in a campus coffee shop, watching a live stream of a panel discussion titled Institutional Respect from Policy to Practice. On the screen, a university dean was quoting Robert's words from that flight. "It's not about a seat. It's about all the seats I wasn't allowed to take." Kayla's eyes welled up. She had written a full essay about that moment. It had been picked up by The Atlantic. She didn't care about the byline. She cared that people read it, that they saw him. In a quiet office at Skybridge Airlines HQ, Jordan Pierce filed the last internal memo on the case. Dana Whitaker had formally resigned. The company was partnering with 3 veterans organizations, and new language had been added to every crew member's handbook. "We recognize the lived experience of those who served, and we will treat every passenger with the assumption of dignity, not suspicion." Pierce leaned back in her chair. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. In a training center across the country, a young flight attendant in training replayed the video on her tablet. She watched the shove, the silence, the moment that changed everything. And when her instructor asked the class what they saw, she didn't say viral moment. She said, "A man who reminded the world how to carry strength without raising your voice." Back on the porch, the sky turned from blue to gold. Robert reached for the envelope. He opened it. Inside the note, handwritten and short. "Some medals are worn, others are lived. Thank you for living yours with honor." It was signed by the Secretary of Defense. Robert smiled. He folded the letter. Not for the trophy shelf, he didn't have one. He placed it inside a book on the porch table. Letters from Soldiers, 1945. Then he looked out again, into the dusk. No reporters, no flashbulbs, just wind and legacy. Not the kind carved into stone, but the kind that lives in people, in passengers who learned, in a law student who found her voice, in a veteran who stood up not for applause but because his silence no longer belonged to someone else. Robert Ellison never asked for recognition. He didn't demand headlines, applause, or revenge. He simply asked to be treated like a human being with the same dignity he had shown this country for over 30 years in uniform. And when that dignity was denied, he didn't explode. He stood, quietly, calmly, completely, and the world finally saw him. This story isn't just about one man on one plane. It's about all the invisible hands that built this nation who are too often pushed aside, ignored, or disrespected until something finally breaks. We live in a world where silence is mistaken for weakness, and prejudice hides behind uniforms and job titles. But, as Robert showed us, you don't need to shout to shake a system. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to sit down when someone tells you you're small. So, tonight before you scroll away, ask yourself, who have we dismissed without ever knowing their name? And how many more Roberts are walking among us, carrying stories we've never bothered to hear? If this story moved you, let's move others. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that demand to be heard, because respect should never have to be earned twice.